The noon hour is upon us, and it's time for this month's edition of Bites and Bits of History, which is sponsored in part by the John and Loretta Hines Foundation, generous supporters of the development project for Tyler History Center, where we are today. And my name is Bill Lawson. I'm Executive Director of Mahoning Valley Historical Society, and I'm on behalf of everybody, our members, our volunteers, our board, our staff. We're happy to have you here today for today's program. So thank you again for those who come back on a regular basis. We really appreciate that, but it's always good to see new faces as well. I'm sorry to start our program today on a somber note, but those of you who are regulars might remember Karen Timlin, who's our visitor service rep down at the gift shop. Well, I'm very sorry to report that she passed away this Monday night past, and she had a series of illnesses, and it took its toll on her. So we are all mourning her loss right now, and the family is planning a celebration of life in the spring, and there'll be public notice about that. But, very sorry to have to start our program that way, but I think Karen's been part of who we are for a long time, more than a decade, and her loss is felt very deeply. Just a few other announcements. If you want to stay after the program to see the exhibits downstairs on the main gallery and the Youngstown Foundation Community History Gallery, we have a new exhibit in the Community History Gallery, which is the Idora Park Experience. And we are actively collecting the Idora Park Experience materials from Jim and Tony Amy, and we've got a nice cross-section or a nice example of what we have in already, and some interpretation of what the objects are and how they got there. And that's going to be open for the balance of 2026, so please check it out at some point, if not today. Come back and take that in. This, of course, is America 250, and this year's Bites and Bits of History program is following along with the theme month set up by the National Semi-Quincentennial Commission and also the States Commission. And we did a little bit of reversal for February and March, but there's still a lot of other programs going on in the community, including tonight at 6 p.m. at the main library branch of Public Library of Youngstown, Mahoning County. And they are doing a screening of an excerpt of Ken Burns' American Revolution with a focus on women's history and literature as it was presented in Ken Burns' series. And it is open to the public. They ask for reservations, but if you show up and come in, they will let you in to see it at the main branch. So that starts at 6 p.m. tonight, and we have Tracy Manning, our Curator of Education, will be on the panel for this presentation tonight, and Tracy's back there by the camera, and any questions or details, you can get those from Tracy. Next Thursday, March 26th, at the Butler Institute of American Art, they're opening their commemorative exhibit called America 250, the Art, Culture, and History of Joseph G. Butler, Jr. And so that is opening that day, and there is a free opening event at 6 p.m. on Thursday the 26th, and Tracy Manning and Dante Bernard, who's over there by the light switches, will be part of the panel presentation for that program as well. So next Thursday at 6 p.m., Butler Institute of American Art. Coming up in April already, we have the Mahoning Valley Cultural Alliance, which is part of our program here at MVHS, and the first of the 2026 series, which is Stories of Immigrants in Mahoning Valley, will focus on German immigrants, and that will be Monday, April 6th, Easter Monday, starting at 5 p.m. at the Saxon Club on, that's South Parade still, yes. So please see Anne Marie or Linda over there for information about reservations. Invitations have gone out, but if you want to take part in that, please check with Linda and Anne Marie about it. So, and I'm almost to introducing our speaker, which is why you're here today. But I just want to point out next month's Bites and Bits of History will be Thursday, April 16th. Again, following on the themes of America 250 and transportation for the month of April. The program will be Getting Around, a history of transportation in the Mahoning Valley, and it will be presented by yours truly. So I won't be doing introductions next month. But today, we are very pleased to have Sean Posey back, who has done a number of programs for us for Bites and Bits of History. Sean is a practicing historian and librarian, and his work has appeared in numerous publications, including Echoes Magazine from Ohio History Connection, Bloomberg, City Lab, Salon, and Bill Moyers and Company. He is the author of Lost Youngstown and Historic Theaters of Youngstown and Mahoning Valley, and The Hidden History of Youngstown and Mahoning Valley. And Sean currently is a librarian at the Austintown branch of the Public Library of Youngstown and Mahoning County, and presenting today's program, which is The Fight for Workers' Rights in the Mahoning Valley, Sean Posey.
Thank you very much for coming out, especially to hear about labor history, which is a portion of American history which over the decades has faded further and further into history itself. And even on days like Labor Day, once a year, we're lucky if we get any lessons on the history of the labor movement in the United States, which is really indivisible for the fight for workers' rights. So, to give you a little background, why did we need a fight for workers' rights? Where did the American Labor Union and the union movement come from? A movement which was so important to the Mahoning Valley, and really the Mahoning Valley's history is emblematic of all the larger themes of American labor history. Well, if we go back, way back into the past, in 1859, Abraham Lincoln gave a speech to the Wisconsin State Agricultural Society, and in the speech he talked about an older concept of American freedom, a concept which we do not recognize anymore, and one of which you maybe have never even heard of. In the 18th and 19th centuries, in Lincoln's world, freedom was commonly understood in Republican terms. So a free person was not subject to another's arbitrary will. Economic independence, the owning of land, your own tools, your own shop, was the material basis of freedom. So dependence, whether on a master, like in slavery, a patron, or employer, was politically dangerous. So why did they believe that? Well, slavery, of course, which was the animating issue of Lincoln's time, was the ultimate unfreedom, where a human being was basically reduced to a beast of burden. However, as the Southern slave masters were so often pointed out, permanent wage labor, that is working for another for most or all of your life for wages, was also troubling, even if it was quote-unquote voluntarily. So if you were a hireling for life, as the term went, that is, if you worked for someone else for your whole life for wages, that carried a moral and civic stigma. However, even as Lincoln said these words, all of this was changing. For the second half of the 19th century was the Second Industrial Revolution, which was going to sweep away this concept of freedom and sweep away entire ways of life and replace it with life centered around the great manufacturing engine of the United States, which would become the preeminent force in the 20th century. So the old ideal of the artisan, the craftsman, the small owner was independence, skill, control over your own pace of work, which also, of course, extended to the agricultural world. And in the 19th century, the United States is still an agricultural society. And also the pride of craftsmanship. However, as industries grew and big industrial cities like Youngstown came into their own, more and more people would be swept off the land and out of cottage industry and into the large-scale workshops and mills that were going up in the industrial north and elsewhere. So this old artisan ideal is gone, and the old American idea of independence also has to change as well. So what powered the Industrial Revolution? What made the Industrial Revolution possible? Carbon, pulled out of the ground, fossil fuels. And of course, at first, the primary fossil fuel that made industry possible was coal. And at coal, of course, you had miners. Now, mining was the most dangerous job in the industrial world, throughout the entirety of industrial history, essentially. And miners who worked underground without a lot of supervision enjoyed some sense of independence, but they paid for it in the way that they had to live under company rule. So, of the nearly 5 million tons of coal that was mined in 1875 in Ohio, 21% came from the Mahoning Valley. And in that year, Trumbull County came in first in terms of coal yields. However, by the early 1900s, most of the mines were, quote, worked out, as the term went, in this area. However, before iron and really steel were huge, mining made the iron industry possible. But what was life like for miners in the Mahoning Valley? Well, this quote comes from a very good book called No Strength Without Union. It's hard to find, but it's about the labor history of the state of Ohio. And a Trumbull County miner with a wife and several children in Trumbull County, with both of his 2 teenage girls working, he managed to earn about $538 during 1878. From this sum, the company deducted $36 for rent, $25 for coal. He was a coal miner and he had to pay for coal. $16 for lamp oil and $5 for tool sharpening, leaving him about $1 a week to feed and clothe his family. So not surprisingly, during the economic downturn of the early 1870s, there was a big strike, coal strike in the Mahoning and Tuscarawas valleys in 1873. And if you want a good detailing of that history, I would recommend this book, Coal War in the Mahoning Valley, The Origin of Greater Youngstown's Italians. So there's an ethnic and labor history attached to this as well. And what the coal companies did, and this would be a tactic that was copied by the steel industry later on, was they brought in strike breakers, African Americans from the South, and strike breakers, Italian immigrants from Europe. It should be noted, though, that both groups, the blacks from the South and the Italians from Europe, did not know that they were going to be used as strike breakers. So the company pulled the wool over their eyes, too. However, this strike ended in violence, and what Ben Larisha, one of the co-authors of this book, calls maybe the first lynching of an Italian in this part of the country, due to the fact that ethnic and racial tensions were played up. So the companies really saw that if they could divide workers by ethnic and racial tension, something that was already there, they could forestall things like the 8-hour day, which was the animating issue of the labor movement in the late 19th century, and also, of course, their worst fear, which was the formation of unions. This is a little noted event. During the same year as the strike in 1873, the Miners National Association formed here in Youngstown. And here's a picture of the group in Youngstown in 1873. It was headed by a labor organizer by the name of John Sini, or Sini, I'm not sure which. It sought to organize all miners into a single industrial union. So what was an industrial union? This would be a huge dividing point in the American labor movement for decades. You had craft unionism and industrial unionism. Craft unions organized workers according to their skill. So they were basically there for skilled workers. Industrial unions sought to form a union for all workers. So an industrial union for coal mining would be for everybody involved in the coal mining industry, regardless of what they did. And that also encompassed so-called unskilled workers. This would be a huge fight that would extend all the way into the 1930s, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. The Miners' National Association didn't last long, but this effort would later influence the formation of the big mining union, the United Mine Workers, which also formed in Ohio, in Columbus, in 1890. So you've probably heard this term before. In fact, there's a television show based on it, though it doesn't focus on anything I'm going to talk about here today, the so-called Gilded Age. This was the late 19th, early 20th century when, because of the Industrial Revolution, economic and wealth inequality explodes. And so what was life for workers like in Ohio during that time period? Well, there was little in the way of public assistance for the unemployed, unlike today. The middle and the upper class saw economic downturns, which happened very frequently, and depressions as essentially normal. And there would be two big ones during this time period. The 1873 to 1879 Depression, which was actually called the Great Depression until the bigger Great Depression of the late 1920s, early 1930s. This went on for about 6 years. It was followed in 1893 by the Panic of 1893, another devastating economic downturn. So it wasn't just economic issues, it was also working conditions. So here's a couple of quotes that I also pulled from that book, No Strength Without Union. So the iron industry in the late 19th century, before steel was the big industry here, but what did iron workers have to deal with? Well, workers in iron were exposed to clouds of fine dust and minute particles of metal and subject to poor ventilation and extreme temperature changes. And they were highly susceptible to tuberculosis and a lot of other diseases. The Cincinnati Department of Health noted in 1878 in a survey they did that it was very difficult to find workers over the age of 50 in the city factories. Most of them were either dead or they were disabled and unable to work anymore. Out of this really extreme situation came a very interesting event, which unfortunately isn't much talked about anymore, though it's very notable in Ohio history and American history, and that's Coxey's Army. So in 1894, in Ohio, this is really the Depression of 1893 is starting to take hold, and a guy by the name of Jacob Coxey, who was not an unemployed worker, was not a laborer, he was a successful Massillon businessman, got together a group of unemployed men and decided that he was going to march them from Massillon and to Washington, D.C. to present to Congress what he called his Good Roads Plan. And the idea behind it is actually something that's pretty much accepted nowadays, that during severe economic downturns, the government would either inject money into the economy or put people to work. So Coxey's idea was you could take all the unemployed workers and put them to work on public works projects like helping improve the American road system, which was absolutely atrocious during this time period. So Coxey is making his way through Ohio, and across the country there are what the press called industrial armies, other armies of unemployed men who are forming and seeking to come to Washington, D.C. too. Some of them, in fact, out west, considering how far they had to travel, would requisition or basically hijack trains and attempt to make it from the West Coast to Washington, D.C. However, when Coxey made it to Washington, instead of giving a welcome or being able to address Congress, he and the men that he were with were basically arrested and thrown into jail. So Coxey's movement doesn't succeed. However, it has a big impact on the formation and the future of industrial unions, and of course also on the burgeoning American socialist movement, which will gather strength. And in 1900 or 1901, you'll have the formation of the Socialist Party of America under Eugene Debs, if you're familiar with him. Another labor organizer and radical who also was arrested famously in 1918 in Canton, Ohio, for speaking up against World War I, and would be sentenced to 10 years in jail under the Woodrow Wilson administration. Also, culture is affected by all this. And for us here in the Mahoning Valley, we have a very interesting, if often forgotten, cultural figure, a guy by the name of Michael McGovern, the puddler poet, as he was called. So during this time period, poetry or song poetry, written by and for men primarily men in the industrial work world, started to spread across the country. And here we had Michael McGovern. He was a very interesting guy. He was from Ireland originally, and he was educated at a hedge school, basically in a legal school during that time period. He was an Irish nationalist and a Catholic. He fled to England, where he found work in the steel industry, and when the authorities caught up with him again because of his revolutionary activity, he went to the United States, and he ended up here in the Mahoning Valley. Now, he was a puddler. Puddlers were part of what Karl Marx called the labor aristocracy. That is, the most skilled, the most privileged workers at the very top. But what was puddling? This is a very long ago term. Puddling was a very important, crucial part of the iron industry. It was a laborious process of creating wrought iron from pig iron. It took a knowledge of metallurgy along with brute strength and incredible endurance. So it was described as cooking soup with a spoon. As former puddler Pat Quinn put it, it was a hot job. You could work in the summer and the winter with your shirt off. And it wasn't uncommon for puddlers and the puddlers' helpers to be so hot during their shifts that they would pull off their boots and literally pour out water. There was moisture and sweat that had accumulated in their boots. So a prestigious job, an important job, but very dangerous. And puddlers didn't have long lifespans, as you would imagine. But McGovern actually lived to be relatively old, though he did not, of course, work as a puddler his whole life, because you imagine once you got to be a certain age, you weren't going to be doing very much puddling. But he was acclaimed in this area and across the country among laborers for his poetry, a lot of which, or most of which, was written about industrial work and laborers and unions and things like this. And I pulled one. A lot of his stuff appeared in the Vindicator. In 1899, he actually had a book of his work come out. But this is a little poem I found in the Vindicator from 1901. "'Tis thus the big corporation would grab and monopolize all, while little competitors weakened, being crushed, as it were, to the wall. But labor, though feeble as units, by union may furnish a power as strong as the cyclone that raises the structures of years in an hour." So McGovern, a fascinating figure, very important for this time, but like I said, kind of forgotten today. And if I remember correctly too, I believe he is the great-grandfather of Mahoning McGovern. Little side note there. So by the 20th century, the iron industry in the Mahoning Valley is giving way to the steel industry. So what is life like in the steel industry? Well, it's incredibly difficult, and these are some statistics I gathered to give you a sense of what it would be like. In 1910, 30% of the labor force worked 7 days a week. So this isn't 7 days a week as an office job, this is 7 days a week in the mills. 75% worked a 12-hour day. So if you worked a 12-hour day, if you worked in the morning shift or the night shift, there was a period during the month where you would switch. And the workers called that the long turn. And during the long turn, you would be on the job for 24 hours. Incredibly dangerous. The union at the time, such as it was the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, which was a craft union. As I mentioned it before, it was there for skilled workers. However, it was largely weakened or almost broken in 1892 during a big strike in Homestead, Pennsylvania by, of course, Andrew Carnegie, who came down hard looking to break the back of the union. And by the early 1900s, it was a bit of a spent force. And while the Amalgamated was declining, between 1910 and 1914, this gives you an even better idea of what we're talking about 1,500 workers died in U.S. mills. 5,100 were permanently disabled, and about 225,000 were temporarily disabled. This led, probably inexorably, in this area to one of the first very notable strikes, the 1915-1916 East Youngstown strike. This is a picture taken after it was over of a woman on the side of the street with what's left of her belongings after her house burned to the ground. So what was at issue in 1915? Well, workers were getting squeezed by inflation, demand, speed-ups, long hours, and of course World War I was going on. We weren't involved in the war yet, but the mills here were going great guns in order to supply the Allied armies in Europe. So the strike begins over a wage raise and working conditions at Republic Steel and Youngstown Sheet and Tube. And it ends in East Youngstown. I should note this for a second. East Youngstown at the time was not the east side of Youngstown. It's modern day Camel. So it was its own separate polity from the city of Youngstown. The reason it's no longer called East Youngstown is because of this strike itself. So in East Youngstown, company guards of Youngstown Sheet and Tube fire on the strikers. 3 people are dead, and afterward a riot breaks out which burns down most of the business district around Wilson Avenue. And this was such, 3 people dead and $47 million in inflation-adjusted damage. This was such a cataclysm for East Youngstown and for Youngstown that the Youngstown City Fathers put a lot of pressure on East Youngstown to change their name. Because Youngstown was in the name, and this was a national and international story, and the area could never really get rid of the memory of the strike. So about 10 years later, they changed the name to Campbell. It's called Campbell now, or people call it Campbell anyway, but it was named after the president of Youngstown Sheet and Tube, so the name is changed because of that. About a year after this, America enters the Great War, what we now call World War I. These are laborers from Youngstown Sheet and Tube. They're loading steel casings for some sort of bombs or munitions to be sent to Europe. So when the war breaks out, when we enter the war, Woodrow Wilson basically comes to the steel barons and says, we're going to have labor peace during the war. You're not going to crack down on workers. Workers are going to be allowed to organize themselves in unions. And because of this, there's a big movement to try to organize steel, and a national committee for organizing iron and steel workers forms. The idea was in the union movement that if you could unionize the steel industry, which was at the commanding heights of the American economy, you could unionize anything else. This was the big prize. So during the war, they're sending out organizers to all of the big industrial iron and steel cities, including the United States, to organize for what they realize is eventually going to be a strike. And when the war ends, the National War Labor Board, which had been brought together to assure labor peace, that goes away. Woodrow Wilson's interest, of course, Wilson himself basically gets sick and is still in office, but he's almost a vegetable. So he's out of the picture. And the companies revert to the way they were operating before. You still have the 12-hour day, all the other issues. So this leads to not only a big strike in steel, but a wave of strikes in the year 1919. So 1919, the pandemic is still on, right? 1918, the Spanish flu that spread across the United States, it's still basically going on, some parts of it in the early part of 1919. There are 3,600 work stoppages across the country that year, including 237 in Ohio. And the business community gets especially worked up about it because just 2 years earlier you had the Russian Revolution. The communist Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar in Russia, and there's a civil war going on. And this is really, you've heard of the Red Scare, of course, this is really the first Red Scare. So there's an effort by the companies to connect strikes and worker organizings to the communist movement. And sometimes it's true, as we'll talk a little bit later. But this big steel strike that happens, the Great Steel Strike of 1919, Youngstown is at the center of it. Something like 365,000 guys go out on strike. And it lasts into early 1920, but the steel companies, which had made a lot of money from World War I, basically realize they can wait the strikers out. And they do, and it breaks the back of the strike. Even though several people are killed here in the area, and of course millions of dollars in lost wages and profits go up in smoke, the strike is broken. And this really represents the bottom point of the labor movement, which is all but crushed in the United States by the 1920s. In fact, the companies called the 1920s the New Era. That's where they have total control. And later on in the 1930s, when the little steel strike breaks out here, some workers who survived through the 1920s were interviewed, and I pulled a couple of quotes about how they were treated during that time period. And one gentleman said, "We were nothing but a number. We weren't even identified by our first name. We were called either you Dago, you Hunky, you Black so-and-so." Joe Kerrigan from the U.S. Steelworks later said, "I saw a man being crushed, and I saw people burned. I saw people engulfed in flame too." And some of the ethnic stereotypes, even when I was a kid, my grandmother used to call our family, she said, you know, we were nothing but mill hunks or hunkies. So hunky really wasn't a term of endearment by the mills. Hunkies were considered, like Dagos and like African Americans, as basically just tools that could be worked in, and when they were injured or couldn't work anymore, could be just simply thrown out and replaced with somebody else. So this, of course, is eventually going to blow up when the Great Depression starts. So by the early 1930s, the American economy is collapsing. And in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt defeats Herbert Hoover, who was the president at the time, and begins a series of initiatives which will be called the New Deal. And for our purposes, the one we look at was the National Industrial Recovery Act, which did a lot of things, but one little codicil in it was Section 7A, which said that workers had the right to organize themselves into unions. So even though there wasn't any enforcement mechanism, like there would be in 1935 when this was replaced by the Wagner Act or the National Labor Relations Act, which we still have today, it led to a massive union organizing effort across industries all across the United States. And between the years 1933 and 1934, 100 workers were killed during strikes across the United States. And this brought back the old argument over craft unionism versus industrial unionism. And basically this would be settled by the birth of the CIO. The CIO, or the Congress of Industrial Organizations, emerged as a committee within the AFL. Today it's the AFL-CIO. But the CIO broke away and was basically pushed out of the AFL in the 1930s and became its own entity. And their big goal was, first, they organized the auto industry, the birth of United Auto Workers in the famous Flint sit-down strike in Michigan. The next move was to organize the steel industry, very much like had been tried in 1919. So they form the SWOC, or the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, and once again, there's another strike in 1936. So, to the CIO's amazement, the first company they approach is U.S. Steel. U.S. Steel is by far the biggest steel company, and it basically set the tone for the industry. And amazingly, U.S. Steel agrees to recognize the union right away, without a fight. So the thinking was that the so-called little steel companies would fall into line. This was Bethlehem Steel, Youngstown Sheet and Tube, Republic, but these were not little companies. They were big. They were only little in comparison to U.S. Steel. However, Republic and Youngstown Sheet and Tube here, they do not agree to represent the union. In fact, they close off their mills. They have strike breakers come in, and they begin to stockpile tear gas and weapons and ammunition in preparation for a bloody strike. And that is exactly what happens. So the CIO was reliant on a lot of organizers on the ground. And a lot of them in this area had been in the mills since the 20s, and they were members of the Communist Party, especially an infamous figure by the name of Gus Hall, who later ran for president, became head of the American Communist Party. He came here and was tasked with organizing in Trumbull County. And Gus Hall was a tough figure. He was raised in lumber camps as a kid. He was a fighter, and along with other guys like Robert Burke, communist organizers, they went on the ground and they either sought to win your mind over and get you to join a union, or people like Robert Burke, they couldn't win your mind over, they would beat the crap out of you until you joined the union. These were very tough guys. And later, when the strike ended, Gus Hall warrants would be put out for his arrest, and he was charged with attempting to blow up parts of Republic Steel during the strike. So the strike ultimately does fail, and several people are killed in a gun battle right over here in Poland Avenue in Youngstown. And the effort to organize the steel industry is not successful. They cannot bring the little steel companies to heel. And it will not be successful until World War II breaks out. When World War II breaks out, Franklin Roosevelt finally puts the boot on the neck of the steel companies and says, you will recognize unions or you will not get war contracts. This is a crucial part of eventually getting what the SWAC becomes, and that's United Steelworkers, recognized in 1942. You finally, after decades and decades, get the collective bargaining system that we come to have today. So when the war ends, there's still strikes. There's a strike in 46, there's a strike in 52, there's a giant steel strike in 1959 that some of you might remember that goes on for almost 4 months. But unlike the older strikes, people aren't killed and there's not shooting and bloodshed. It's a different system than happens before the war because of the New Deal and because of the Wagner Act. So you have collective bargaining. And because of this, you get things like the Treaty of Detroit, the so-called Treaty of Detroit in Michigan, where United Auto Workers was able to get from the companies pensions, vacation, health benefits. This is basically the birth of the modern American middle class, coming out of the working class. So guys who 20 years earlier would have been working for nothing and maybe being lucky to survive their job, all of a sudden they had vacations, they had a couple cars, they could send their kids to college, maybe they had a little cabin on the lake. Unheard of prosperity that comes out of this period. But as you see, there's a lot of violence and bloodshed that bought that. And in the steel industry in particular, well into the 70s, there would still be a fight for African Americans to be able to get out of the worst jobs in the mills, the blast furnace and whatever. And it would not be until there was a consent decree in 1974 that would really guarantee that women and African American workers could move up. Of course, unfortunately, what happens a few years after that, the steel industry begins to fall apart. And then all those things change. So just because we're here in the 50s in the post-war area, the struggle wasn't over for everybody in the union movement. And it doesn't end just with steel and labor. Youngstown, you wouldn't be surprised, is a part of some of the most important strikes in other industries, especially industries where women predominate. And here's one that my mother was almost involved in. She came out of nursing school right after this, the 1966 nurses' strike. Some of you might remember this in Youngstown. This was the first nurses' strike in Ohio, and it was a strike in order to win union recognition. It was followed, actually, the same year by the 1966 teachers' strike in Youngstown, which was the first teachers' strike in the state. And from my people, 1980, you even had a library strike that lasted over 3 months. It could maybe be the longest library strike in the United States. I don't know, I can't prove that, but it'd have to be one of the longest. So, and all of these strikes were supported too by the industrial workers in other unions. So you could see Youngstown really was kind of the union town, the labor town par excellence for so long. And of course, all of this is really only eroded by the closing of the mills, deindustrialization, the depopulating of the area. And of course, all of this will affect the union movement at large. And in 2009, for the first time, there were more workers in public sector unions than there were in private sector unions. And that's because of the decrease, not only in industrial jobs, but even today, there's a lot of mills, especially the mini mills, like the one we have out here, companies like Nucor, that are non-union. So by the 21st century, today, in terms of the labor movement or the union movement, it's really almost back to where it was in 1920. The labor movement is on its knees. And almost every year, there are fewer people in unions than there were before. I'm in a union. I'm in the PLAY, the Librarians Union, which is part of SEIU. And earlier in my working career, I was part of the Food and Commercial, what is that union? I should be able to remember it. Anyway, I've been in 2 unions in my life at my age, which makes me an extraordinary rarity today. fact, a number of years ago when I was substitute teaching, I was asking some of my students if any of their parents were in a union, and they said probably no, but they didn't know what a union was, which I had to explain to them. And that in this area should show you kind of where we've come to. But this is a very short look at the long history of the fight for worker rights in the Mahoning Valley, which could take up many talks. We could be here for 3 or 4 hours. You can write a volume of books about this. But I hope this gives you some overview about labor history, which, as I mentioned earlier, has become more and more obscure as the union and the labor movement has declined too. Even our knowledge of these things has declined. And sometimes it makes it difficult to talk about. But I want to thank you for your kind attention. If anybody has any questions or comments, I'd be glad to take them. We have some time, I hope we do. Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
I learned a lot, so thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It was a lot to throw at you in just a short period of time. Anybody else? Any questions or comments?
Talk about the library strike.
Oh, yeah. So the library strike, there was a few library strikes. I believe the first was a strike by the clerical workers and the maintenance workers to get union recognition. And the strike in 1980, if I remember correctly, also starts with the clerical workers, and the librarians go out too. So all of the branches closed for, like I said, I think 3 months or a little over 3 months. And which was really kind of audacious about the library strike is in 1980, if you remember, like, we're in basically a depression here in the Mahoning Valley. You know, the mills are closing, people are leaving. So to have a big strike during those economic times really took some intestinal fortitude. But I think it's a testament to the labor militancy that you still saw in this area. And I don't know if I think there's been another library strike since then, a much smaller one in the 90s, but I don't remember all the details. Yes, sir?
It was a teacher strike that year too.
Okay, well, see, there you go. Yeah, same thing. And yeah, there's been a few big teacher strikes. And yeah, today, you know, when we think about unions, we probably think more about teachers' unions and librarian unions and public sector workers in the government or whatever than we think about steel workers or auto workers, which just goes to show you how the economy has changed too since, you know, 100 years ago, 80 years ago. Yes?
My father made a union at Happy Electric.
Oh, yeah,
in
yep.
the 50s, and he has a Gus Hall story that Gus Hall was coming in on a train and they knew it. So a group of the laborers, the union, got baseball bats, and it was coming in at night to meet him and tell him not to get off the train and not to come in.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that you were saying about Gus Hall and that group of the violence, they had to show up with weapons.
Oh, yeah.
To convince them because they didn't.
Yeah, Gus Hall made his bones in the 1934 Teamster strike. It was basically a strike in Minneapolis that made the teachers union, the Teamsters union, and it was very bloody, and Hall was involved in that. So he had a long record, very, very tough guy.
It could have been 20 years later.
And you know, during the 50s, especially after war, during McCarthyism, it became very difficult for the CIO because the CIO had relied a lot on the communists in the union to organize in the 20s and 30s. So when the government says, you've got communists in their unions, well, they did. They did. And eventually they would push all those people out. So when the little steel strike was over, Gus Hall and his cohorts, the unions wanted to distance themselves from them, even though they had to rely on them at the moment. So it would be tough. It would be like later on when the unions, or some of the unions, especially the Teamsters, were accused of being mobbed up. That was also true, right? They were. And people like Jimmy Hoffa had cut deals with the mob for his own reasons. But he couldn't really deny it. Of course, Hoffa did anyway, but of course, look where Hoffa ended up, in prison, right? So, yeah, allegedly, yeah. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
When the right to work state issues,
I should have mentioned that, and I think I written down this here over. So after the war in 1945 to 1946, when everybody comes home, there's the largest strike wave in American history. And because of it, in 1947, you get the Taft-Hartley Act. And the Taft-Hartley Act put a lot of chains on unions because of the big strike wave, and because, of course, the fear of communism and all these other things. And one of those, part of that was the establishment of right to work. So that's when you see the right to work state starts to spread. And yeah, even though the union movement seems like it's riding high in the late 40s, the Taft-Hartley Act is going to have a lot of consequences for the growth of unions going forward. And people didn't realize it at the time. Harry Truman vetoed the act. He said it was a slave labor act. Of course, Truman was a Democrat, and the Taft-Hartley Act was a Republican initiative, but it did get Democrat votes. So yeah, that's, if you know an older union worker or former union worker, they'll probably bring up Taft-Hartley because it was a big deal. And even for a while, if you remember Michigan, which like Ohio, a very big union state, they became a right to work state for a while. Of course, now they flipped back. But that in and of itself is pretty notable, considering, you know, the long history of the United Auto Workers and the steel workers in Michigan. Yes, sir.
Did you do any research or find anything about the organization of the Bakers Union around here which took on Swable?
You know, I'm vaguely aware of it, but I can't say that I can tell you enough to speak on it intelligently. But I do know what you're talking about. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things, of course, I had to leave out of here. Another big one, of course, would be the Lordstown strike in the 1970s, and that's a whole nother issue. That was a national strike that got national attention, so there was a lot going out there too in the 70s, just some things I couldn't cover, and even the things I covered, I kind of went over them too fast, but I just kind of wanted to give you a taste of a little bit of the labor history. Yes, sir?
Is there a book you could recommend in terms of the union history or union movement?
Boy, yeah, you know, a good one to start was, let me make sure I get the name right. This is a good one. It's pretty accessible. Just want to make sure I have the name right. Let's see. A History of America in 10 Strikes. And the Lordstown strike is part of that. So it just talks about 10 big ones, but it'll give you a good feel of what that's like. There's also another book that's it's not harder to find. You could probably find it used on Amazon, called A Rainbow at Midnight, which is a very good history of the industrial labor movement. Very, very good. I think it came out in the 80s, but you could probably find it online. I don't know if the library has it or not, so I hesitate to tell you if we do. But you know, we also, if you're looking for books on the subject matter, the library, we're also part of Search Ohio. So we're connected to the other public libraries in the state. So you can go on our site and look at what we have and then what all the other libraries have through Search Ohio. You can request books like that. So we can pull books that are harder to find from Cincinnati or Cuyahoga or wherever and have them sent here. So that's something else to think about, just to give a library plug if you're looking for labor-related books. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the first union you belonged to was in the food industry?
Yeah, yes.
The SEIU?
You know, I think it was United Food and Commercial Workers. It was a Giant Eagle. I worked at Giant Eagle. They probably still have the same union there today.
SEIU was in the hospitals too. My mother was in there. And aren't they the ones that are like the big towns like Las Vegas?
Yeah, that's an SEIU time for sure. Yeah, that's what the librarians union I belong to is part of SEIU. But yeah, definitely they represent a lot of different groups in Vegas. Yeah,
But they were
that's
in
very
the
cool.
hospitals here in Youngstown too.
Yeah, yes, they did. Yeah, but I can't remember how long it's been since they became a big union. But yeah, they're one of the bigger unions today. And a lot of unions, like the Teamsters and even the auto workers, if you go on and look at their site, they've taken on people that have nothing to do with like the core business. I think now, I think it's the United Auto Workers that also represent graduate students that teach in school. So that's, but once again, because they lost a lot of their, they lost market share, they've tried to expand by organizing in other industries. And I should mention too, there was an effort called Operation Dixie to try to organize the South, which also failed. And to this day, the South is, that's talk about union organizing, that's the hardest place and kind of always has been. And every once in a while you hear about other efforts to organize the South again, but the union movement, they have a hard enough time organizing anywhere these days. Yes, sir?
I was working one time in Detroit, and Ford had a steel mill at their
The River Rouge.
yeah.
Yeah, that big plant out there, yeah.
It was the only steel mill run by the UAW.
Yeah, yes, that was, the Ford, that was a hard fight too. Henry Ford was vehemently anti-union, and there was a big fight to organize Ford, and he had a guy whose name I can't remember. He had his own internal security force that was there basically just to ferret out union organizers. If there was an organizer in the mill, they'd grab you and just beat you within an inch of your life and be like, get the hell out of here and never come back. It was a tough business up there too. But yeah, that River Rouge plant, I believe they closed that recently. It was out on an island called Zug Island, a real kind of like otherworldly looking place. If you'd ever been up there,
Dirtiest mile on the planet.
What's that?
They call it the dirtiest mile.
Oh, I believe it. Yeah, I believe it. Probably especially during its heyday. Yes, ma'am.
A lot of our companies and factories and that have closed down, and I'm wondering, do you feel that the reason that our unions aren't, maybe people don't know much about unions anymore is because of the factories closing down? And
Well, sure. As unions, as factories closed down or went overseas and union density decreased, yeah, people just came into contact with unions less. And one thing unions did too, and they still do to a certain extent with the power they have, is when you're a member of a union, it's just like we're just a member of the union will also have like an educational initiative where they'd attempt to tell workers, hey, here's what's going on in the world and the economy, you should be aware of, and here's what we're trying to do, we want to give money to this person, and so on and so forth. So when people aren't members of unions either, they don't get that. So yeah, there was a culture around unions, more so in Europe than here, but still here too. And as union membership has declined, yeah, that culture too has declined. And like I said, you get the kids, in my high school class that didn't have the first clue what I was talking about. It's just blank stares. Anybody else? Oh, yes, sorry.
Yeah, I'm with UAW Local 1112, I used to be an officer at the local. Speaking on that, what you were saying about how they diversified and moved out.
Yeah.
At the time, we had the Pro Logistics, which was a trucking company, we have them under us. We had the, I feel it now, the Family Job Services, which is almost like unheard of. We have supervisors that we represent.
Wow.
We had one time, we had Trumbull County Correctional Officers with us.
Oh, that's
We
interesting.
had them, we had a good contract with them, but they ended up going back to the benevolent union. Yeah, we diversified a lot with that. UAW at one time, it was so big under Ruger that they actually formed the ASPE union too.
Oh, yeah, that's a great point. Yes, very, very good point. Thank you very much for that. Somebody else over here? Yes, ma'am.
During the 20s and 30s strikes, how adequate was the union funds in assisting the striking workers?
Oh, yeah, well, the 20s, there wasn't really much going on. Yeah, but even in 1919, during the Great Steel Strike, there was a big effort to, and that's what ended up hurting them as the strike went longer, was they had, like down on Boardman Street, they had a front there where people could go and get groceries and food and stuff for the weak strikers. But, the steel companies realizing that they could extend the strike, they weren't going to go out of business, but it would get harder and harder over time to keep people fed and whatever. And that was even a big issue in the 59 strike here, which was like 4 months. It was a long time for people to not be able to pay their rent or whatever, and there were union funds, but, it wasn't a bottomless pit. But more difficult in the 20s and 30s, especially in the 30s. I mean, lot of the strikes weren't that long, they were more short and violent. So that was the one thing too. Some movies do it well. If you ever saw the old movie Hoffa with Jack Nicholson in the 90s, there's a good segment where early in the 30s, the beginning of his career, where you see how violent it was, and like people being killed and strikes, like they would just bring the guys in with the baseball bats, and like that's how you would settle it. So it was dangerous business. So later on, it became more about the strikes getting longer and economic support for families. But earlier, it was more about like surviving, the initial stages of the strike, where there was going to be a lot of violence, probably. Yes, sir.
Go to what you were saying. I was involved in a teacher strike for 5 weeks back in the 80s. And the union didn't provide us with money, but what they did was they provided us with interest-free loans.
Oh.
So we could borrow some money, make a house payment or whatever, and then when we went back to work, then they gave us a very extended period of time to pay the loan back with no interest.
Sure. Oh, that's a very good example. Yeah, having when you have a strike like that, having to think strategically about what you can do if the strike is going to last a while. And now, I'm sorry.
Just a suggestion is, I recently saw a documentary about the 1937 Black & Decker steel strike Black & Decker industry in Kent. And it was, the company had hired scabs to go in, and the workers fought them off. And so it's more a story about how the workers succeeded in, getting their strike settled because they fought off the scabs, and they actually had the scabs arrested. And,
well, that would show you how different the 30s were, especially under Roosevelt. If you would go back a few decades, there wasn't even really scabs. There were groups like, if anybody's ever heard of the Pinkertons, the Pinkerton Detective Agency. And it wasn't really a detective agency, it was more like muscle for hire. And they would bring in the Pinkertons and, they would try to kill the main organizers. And the famous example of that is the Homestead strike, as I mentioned earlier, against Carnegie in 1892, where they brought the Pinkertons in barges on the river, and the workers saw them, and they started throwing out Molotov cocktails and shooting them on the barges, and they captured the Pinkertons as they came ashore. And, they didn't end up killing any of them, but they almost did. But that was kind of how it was done back then, And then, as I mentioned, the 30s and the little steel strike, they just brought in the guns and the tear gas, and they held people up in the mills and got ready for, a long and bloody strike.
I just want to make a comment on it.
Yeah, sure.
My dad was one of the people that went down to the south and recruited from Cleveland, Mississippi. Him and his brother, they brought them up. They didn't know that, like you said earlier, they didn't know there would be strike breakers.
Yeah.
That was an opportunity for them to better their lives, so they came
Right.
here. And for a lot of years, they were treated rotten because they were looked at as being scabs.
Yeah.
My dad worked one of the worst areas, the coke plant, for those
Yes,
steel
yeah.
production. For a lot of years, he was here to eventually work his way to crane operator, which was a major achievement for him coming from where he had started in the mill. That was it.
Yeah, you can understand, especially in the Jim Crow days, why people wanted to get out of the South. But yeah, generally they didn't tell people that they were going to be strike breakers. And there's a great movie that came out in the 80s about a coal strike in the early 20th century, and the name of it's going to escape me. James Earl Jones is in it. And he's part of a group of African Americans that they bring up to be strike breakers, and they don't know about it. And they bring him in, and the white co-workers are attacking him, and he's like, hey, we didn't know about what we were getting into, but, we will organize with you. And there's an effort to try to get the black and the white coal miners to work it out between themselves. And I don't know if anybody remembers the name of that name. All I can remember is James Earl Jones was in it. Very good movie from the 80s. Anyone else? All right. Well, thanks a lot. I appreciate it. Thanks so much for coming.
All right. Bill had to step out early, so I'll close you guys out. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Sean. Wonderful as always. And we will see you back on April 16th for Bill's presentation, Getting Around, a history of Mahoning Valley transportation. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you soon.